Hi, I'm Aaron Sampson, and I've been a professional in the IT industry since 1995. With a primary focus on technical training, I can be found most of the time producing and delivering learning content centered around network infrastructure and services. I've also been involved with extensive practical implementations in a variety of operational capacities, including architecture and design, deployment and implementation, administration and management, and various other technology based roles. Printers have a lot of moving parts, and problems are inevitable. In this course, I'll explore basic troubleshooting considerations for printers, including common issues such as paper jams and print quality problems. I'll explore potential driver compatibility issues along with common printer error codes and how to approach those errors. From there, I'll examine firmware updates and learn why they're required and how they can resolve certain issues, and explore how to resolve screen display and printer output issues, and discover how to calibrate and clean printers. Lastly, I'll discuss how to establish printer connectivity, perform printer calibration and initiate printer test pages, manage print queue issues, and deal with page orientation and general finishing issues such as stapling and hole punching. This course will help to prepare learners for the CompTIA A Core 1 or 220-1101 certification exam. In this video, we'll take a look at troubleshooting common issues with printers, and we will begin with, of course, the most obvious issue, which is to simply ensure that the device has power. Now, along with power is a related feature known as sleep mode, which of course is also very common on devices such as laptops. And this may happen with your printer as well. So if you submit a print job, it might come out just fine. But then once that job is completed, if there's no activity for a certain amount of time, the device may go into a sleep mode. Now, it is supposed to come out of sleep mode when you submit another print job, but I have encountered devices that just have issues coming out of sleep mode. So typically what needs to be done in that case is to just cycle the power of the device itself. Just turn it off and turn it on again. Now, availability can refer to a couple of different things. Clearly, if the printer is turned on and it is accepting print jobs, then you can consider it to be available. But there could be something like a network issue that is preventing that system from communicating. If, for example, it was unable to obtain an IP address, then it's turned on, but it's just not available to accept any print jobs. And another feature of some printers is, in fact, to have them set to only be available during certain times of the day. For example, if you're in an environment where very large print jobs need to be submitted that simply take a lot of time to process, then there might be a set time of day where those jobs can be submitted so that the printers are available for much shorter print jobs during the busiest times of day. So perhaps you can only submit the very long print jobs toward the end of the day. Now, that of course is going to come down to the environment, but many operating systems hosting many different types of printers do have the option to configure various times of day where they are or aren't available. So you just need to make sure that you are attempting to print to a printer that is available. Now, with respect to some other considerations, the power adapter could also be the problem. So maybe the device, of course, does not have power. That's the first thing you should check, as mentioned. But it might not be anything to do with the device. It could actually just be the power adapter itself. So if you can test it by plugging it into another device if you have another one that uses the same adapter. That can at least help you to identify if that's the problem or if it is the device itself. Then, of course, all of the cables that are involved. If it's a network cable, then, of course, check the connection at both ends, and the same thing goes for a USB cable. If it is directly and locally connected to a host computer, then, of course, there are cable connections on both ends. Make sure that they are both secure. If it is a network printer, then you do have to apply standard troubleshooting for any type of network device, such as the IP address, if it has a valid address configuration, or if it does not. If it simply is not able to be located on the network by the client systems, or if it is connected to a wireless network, then certainly verify the status of its Wi-Fi connectivity. And another very common issue is the drivers. Typically, each printer needs its own specific driver. Now, there are some scenarios whereby a given manufacturer will create a driver package, if you will, that is suitable for several different types of devices, but by and large, you need to have the specific driver for the specific model, for the specific operating system, for the specific platform. So let's just say that you have Model A from Company A. You need to make sure that the driver is for that model, and typically the best way to obtain it is to download it from their website. Then you need to make sure it is for the appropriate operating system and the appropriate version of the operating system, for example, something like Windows 10. Then with respect to the platform, that refers to either 32-bit versus 64-bit. Now, most operating systems these days are 64-bit, but you may still be dealing with some legacy systems that are 32-bit, and you cannot use a 32-bit driver on a 64-bit operating system and vice versa. So the driver has to be correct and consistent across all of those requirements. In addition, of course, there can be standard mechanical issues, such as a paper jam, a paper mismatch, incorrect paper tray issues, and or verifying the ink type. Now, the paper jam is usually fairly obvious, but certain devices do have the paper enclosed entirely within drawers or trays, so you can't really see if the paper has jammed, but most devices are able to send you a notification either directly through to your operating system or at least on a display for the device itself, so it would indicate that the paper has jammed. A paper mismatch is simply the wrong size paper in the incorrect tray, and the paper tray issue simply means that perhaps you are attempting to print from the incorrect tray. As for the ink type, that of course will depend on the type of printer, but let's just go with something like an inkjet printer. Typically, any given printer will require a very specific cartridge, but any given cartridge is usually compatible with several different models of printer. So just make sure you're attempting to install the correct type. And if you do need to purchase new cartridges and you aren't certain what you need, ideally take an old one with you so that you know you get the right size and format. Now, in terms of some of the other issues that you might encounter, the print queue is the component that is responsible for holding jobs until they can be processed. And if you do have a lot of jobs waiting in the queue, then it is possible that the queue can simply freeze. Now, this is a service on most systems that can be restarted. For example, on a Windows server, it's known as the print spooler service. So if you simply restart the spooler service, this will usually get the queue going again. However, existing jobs may have to be resubmitted. As for the physical device itself, you may need to calibrate the printer from time to time, and this is typically indicated when you are receiving print jobs that just don't seem to match up in terms of either the colors or the alignment of the images. So this is a standard maintenance process that should be done regularly, and in many cases it's something that is done automatically when you install new ink cartridges, or at least you are prompted to perform a calibration when those new cartridges are installed. In addition, there can, of course, be issues with the software applications themselves that are trying to print, so it might not be a problem with the printer at all. Rather, the application is simply failing to submit the print job, so you may need to save your work, close the application, and restart it, then try printing again. And certainly be mindful of any or all error messages that you are either receiving directly on your computer or on the device itself. Most printers these days do have a screen on the front where, of course, you can see messages, so just check to see what kind of messages you are receiving. Now, if the print jobs are being produced, but there are simply quality issues, then you might want to print a test page. This can help you to determine what kind of quality issues are being encountered. For example, if you need to align the print heads or clean the nozzles, a test page can usually determine what the issue is. If it's a multifunction device, typically the test page can be scanned so that it can actually see, for lack of a better word, where the quality issues are. And again, coming back to availability, you should simply check the network settings to ensure that you are attempting to print to a printer that is available, and also consider the security settings. In almost any networked environment, there are certain users who may or may not be able to print. So if you're attempting to print to a printer that you do not have access to, then you will typically encounter an access denied error message. But in both of those cases, of course, it's not an issue with the printer itself, rather it's the configuration. So whether that is correct or not may depend on administration and how they've implemented the configuration of that printer, but you could at least submit a trouble ticket to have it investigated if you feel like you should be able to print to that device. Finally, with respect to the physical type of printer, as far as laser printers are concerned, common issues of course include the color and or black and white settings with respect to the toner that you are using. And of course, the most common maintenance task is to simply replace the toner, but be mindful that you have placed the correct toners into the correct locations. Again, just like an inkjet printer, it can be possible to install the blue cartridge into the black space. So the same thing might be possible on your laser printer. And if you are getting issues with the physical print job itself, then certainly check the status of the drum and or the fuser. The drum is the component responsible for actually producing the image, but if there is damage to the drum, such as a scratch, then you might always see a line on the page, and the fuser is responsible for literally fusing the toner to the paper. So if there's a problem with the fuser, then the toner won't stick to the paper, so you'll always see a very faded image. And if it's an inkjet printer, then again, be mindful of the color and or the black and white configuration. Are the cartridges in the correct location? Or perhaps also investigate the settings of the printer, because it is possible that it was set to only print in black and white. So users are attempting to produce color images, but they're only receiving black and white. Of course, check the status of the ink cartridges and make sure they simply have ink. And as mentioned, if you are getting quality issues, typically this is indicative of needing to perform a calibration of some kind, usually aligning the print heads or cleaning the print nozzles, because of course they can become clogged over time. So again, a little bit of preventative maintenance will usually help to address these problems, but ultimately printers have a lot of moving parts and there are a lot of things that can simply go wrong with printers. So they do require a little bit of extra attention, particularly in very busy print environments. In this video, we'll take a look at resolving issues with paper jams and paper size when it comes to print jobs. Now, the paper jam, of course, is exactly as it sounds, but it's really where the paper has jammed that can be the issue. Typically, it's in the feeder or past it. Now, that seems fairly obvious to say, but it quite simply means that the paper can jam on the way in or on the way out, depending on the make and model and the type of rollers that you tend to have. Now, one way or another, of course, the paper jam needs to be cleared, which typically involves just opening the case and attempting to clear the jammed paper. Now, ideally, this should be done using some kind of a maintenance button or a paper feed button, which quite simply just spins the rollers without doing anything else so that it can hopefully eject the paper. But in some cases, that can actually crumple the paper even more and actually jam it even worse. So there are scenarios where you may just need to try to manually pull the paper out, but you need to be careful with that as well, because of course you can rip the paper, which does not clear the jam, but it may then get it to the point where the paper feed might at least be able to pull the rest of the paper through. Now, other issues can include the paper size, of course, and if this is simply incorrect, then the paper might not fully eject, or it might come out in a wrinkled state. So quite simply, check the paper size and ensure that you are using the appropriate size for that tray. And if that's the reason that any kind of a jam is happening, then of course clear that jam and then just use the correct paper size for that tray and resubmit your print job. Now, there can also be issues with multiple pages being fed through at a time instead of just a single page. And this can happen if the paper itself is quite thin, or if perhaps it's a little bit damp and the pages are sticking together. And I should also mention that it can actually happen when it's very dry as well, because static can build up, which causes the pages to stick together. In which case you can try to just take all of the pages out and fan them out, then reload, but you also need to simply check the status of your pickups and rollers. These are the components that are responsible for pulling the pages into the printer and ejecting them out when the print job is completed. So if they're damaged or if they're worn out, then you might often encounter multiple pages being fed through. And that can lead to more paper jams because, of course, only one page is supposed to go through at a time. But if you're feeding multiple pages in, then it gets too thick because there are simply too many pages, which again can lead to the paper jam. And you're back to the point where now you're simply dealing with paper jams, but of course it's the issue of the rollers themselves that are causing them. So quite simply, just verify that you are using the correct paper, that it's the correct size, that it's the correct format, in the correct tray, and if the pickups and rollers themselves seem like they are in good condition, then you should encounter minimal paper jams, but they can still happen at any time. But once it is cleared, then simply resubmit the job. It really is just a matter of ensuring that you aren't getting paper jams all the time. And if you are, it's most likely indicative of a problem with that printer itself. But I should also mention that if, for example, damp paper was the problem, then maybe that paper is being stored in a place that is continually damp, or maybe the printer itself is located in an area that is very damp. So that would be a little less likely, but it's still something to consider. Ultimately, if it does appear to be the device itself, such as a problem with the pickups and rollers, they are replaceable in many models, but in some inkjet printers, the cost of maintenance might not be worth it. In other words, it might simply be cheaper to replace the entire printer itself. Laser printers, however, or much larger units, will likely have replaceable pickups and rollers, in which case it would certainly cost less than replacing the entire unit. So it will come down to the type of device and what you're looking at in terms of maintenance cost versus replacement cost. In this presentation, we'll examine troubleshooting some common issues related to print quality, beginning with what's known as banding, whereby your printed pages quite literally have bands or lines across the page. Now, these can be light or dark, and they're typically vertical on the page, but they can be horizontal depending on the orientation. But banding tends to be a little more common on laser printers, and it's usually just an issue with the toner cartridge itself. In other words, it's a fairly fixable problem simply by replacing the cartridge. So as it starts to get low or worn out, you end up with these bands on your printed pages. Now, it can happen with inkjet printers, but in those cases, it would be an issue with the print heads or the print nozzles, so it might not be correctable by simply replacing the cartridge. You may need to try to clean the nozzles or perhaps align the print heads, but in many cases, just performing that standard maintenance will usually correct banding issues. Now, similarly, blurs and smears are exactly as they sound. The print output is quite simply blurry or smeared. And while this can be an issue with the toner cartridge or the print heads or the nozzles, it could also be a problem with the pickups and or the rollers or even the fuser on a laser printer. But in fact, another common cause is an incorrect media type, most notably photographic paper versus regular paper. So you might be attempting to print a photographic job, but on regular paper or vice versa. And with respect to photographic paper itself, it is typically only photographic on one side. So it's possible that you loaded the paper in upside down, even though you've chosen the correct tray. So once again, just verify that you are using the correct media type in the correct tray, in the correct orientation. Because if any of those are incorrect, you can end up with a very blurry or smeared image. If it's a matter of color issues and or blocked nozzles, then of course there are several symptoms that you will find, particularly with respect to color issues. You might encounter poor color representation in terms of what you are seeing on the screen versus what you actually get on the printed page. There could be missing colors, which of course could be indicative of an ink cartridge running low, but it could also be an issue with the print head or the nozzles, so they might need to be cleaned. And of course, if it is low on ink, then simply replace the cartridge. If it's a blocked nozzle entirely, then you might want to consider actually using a lower capacity ink cartridge. Now, clearly, the higher capacity cartridges are a little more convenient because we don't have to replace them as often, but because they last longer, you can get more buildup on any given nozzle. So you can try to just clean the print heads. That hopefully will resolve the problem, but since a lower capacity cartridge does not produce as many print jobs, their print heads actually tend to stay cleaner. Other issues with poor image quality can certainly result from issues such as photographs and very intensive graphics. These would typically require the correct settings on the printer itself to ensure that you are achieving the quality desired, because it is very possible that the printer might have been set on some kind of color saving mode or just a very basic level of quality. So if you are trying to print a very high quality photograph or a graphic image, then just double check the settings of that particular print job, and of course ensure that you are using the correct paper. Again, something like photographic paper is required if you want photographic quality. The driver that's being used or the configuration settings for that particular print job or the entire printer itself may need to be verified as well. Maybe you are choosing the correct settings, but if you've got a problem with the driver, it may never produce a quality image, and vice versa. Maybe the driver is correct, but the configuration settings are wrong. Always check the ink levels, of course, and or the toner cartridge if it's a laser printer, but any one of those can be responsible for producing a poor quality image. If it's not immediately evident as to what the problem is and you're just trying to troubleshoot the quality, then certainly check the status of the drivers, see if there is an update drivers for that particular device that can help solve the problem. And it might not be an issue with the device itself. It could be the original source file. Perhaps it does not have the resolution required to produce the quality that you want. So for example, if you think about something like a photograph, there may be situations where that particular file has different sizes. Now, I'll give you a very specific example of that. If I go to email a graphic file such as a photograph from my mobile phone, when I attach it and send it, it prompts me to choose the file size. And if I send a low resolution file, then of course it is a smaller file, so it transfers more easily. But when you go to print that file, there's nothing that you can do to increase its resolution. So you would need to contact me and ask me to send the higher resolution file. You simply might not notice it at first. Standard maintenance, such as align print heads, can also help to produce better quality images. And in some cases, you may be able to actually lower the print speed. Now, this is going to depend on the make and the model and the configuration options, but there are devices that do allow you to print at lower speeds to enhance the quality. Now, of course, the job will take longer, but you get a better quality image. Finally, you might also want to consider the actual printing environment. In other words, is it very hot? Is it very cold or dry or very damp? All of those can affect the quality of your image. And that goes for the supplies as well and how they are handled. You don't want to store standard supplies such as ink and toner cartridges in any location that has extremes of environment, such as too hot or too cold, too dry or too damp. And ultimately, really just perform regular maintenance on the devices is the best bet to ensure the highest quality. Of course, you can always verify the settings of the device and the driver and all of those other conditions, but if all of the settings are correct and the drivers are up to date, but you simply just don't perform enough maintenance on that printer, you may never get the quality that you want. So regular maintenance really is the key to ensuring that the printer itself does not become too worn out, for lack of a better word, to the point where it simply cannot produce the quality that you need, in which case, if it goes too far, maintenance may no longer be sufficient. In other words, you could be looking at having to replace the entire device itself. Different printer models, obviously, and some will require a very specific driver. Other manufacturers will release driver suites that are suitable to many of their models, but ultimately you still have to make sure that you get the correct driver for your printer and your operating system. Now, not only the operating system itself in terms of the platform, such as Windows or Mac, you also need to make sure it's the correct version of that operating system. In other words, there is very likely going to be a separate driver for something like Windows 7 versus Windows 8 or Windows 10. And again, in some cases, certain drivers will be acceptable across different versions, but just make sure that you are selecting the one that is appropriate for your version. And again, it's always good to go and check periodically to see if any updates have been released. Now, that said, I will also add that in many cases, once you have installed the driver successfully, many devices will go and check for updates on their own. So you may notice that when you go to submit a print job, you might get a message indicating that an update is available. But that is also going to depend on the make and model. Sometimes you do have to check manually, particularly if the printer itself is a little older. And one final note on just the operating system, another consideration is the platform of that operating system. In other words, 32-bit versus 64-bit. You cannot use a 32-bit driver on a 64-bit operating system, nor can you use a 64-bit driver on a 32-bit operating system. So ensure that everything is compatible across the board. Now, if you do suspect that it could be related to the driver and you are trying to troubleshoot, then you might encounter situations where the printer may not be working at all, and that is quite likely if you do have the incorrect driver, although it may actually still appear to be online. In other words, the printer is visible, but you can't submit any print jobs. You just keep getting errors. So in this case, ideally, of course, you should uninstall whichever driver is present and reinstall the correct and/or updated print drivers. In some cases, it might just be a matter of updating, but you still need the newer driver because maybe something has also updated with your operating system and there's just some kind of compatibility problem now. So the updated driver may have addressed that issue that arose because of the update to the operating system. In addition, you can also try to entirely uninstall and or reinstall the whole printer itself. So rather than just trying to update the driver or remove that driver and add in a different one, just entirely uninstall the whole printer. Remove it completely, then reinstall it. Typically, this will restore the printer operation, provided, of course, that you do now have the correct driver. So, in other words, if it was just a driver issue, and you are attempting to reinstall the entire printer with the same incorrect driver, clearly this will not help. But as long as you have identified and or verified that you do have the correct driver, then certainly uninstalling everything and reinstalling with the correct driver should restore the printer operation. Lastly, if you just aren't certain what the issue might be, then within your operating system, there may be an option such as a print troubleshooter that you can run, or if, for example, you are running a Windows system, you can simply try to update Windows itself, and that of course goes for other operating systems as well. But particularly with respect to Windows, it does also offer what's known as compatibility mode, which might be something that would work if you're dealing with an older device. In other words, you maybe have run a Windows update and or installed a newer driver for the device, but now it actually doesn't work anymore because the device itself is simply too old. So Windows does give you an option to run that driver in compatibility mode for things like earlier operating systems. So let's take the example of maybe you were running Windows 8 and then you installed Windows 10 and now the printer no longer works even though you've installed a driver for Windows 10. If you run it in compatibility mode, you can specify that it should operate as if it were in Windows 8, in which case the printer will quite literally believe that it is attached to an earlier version of the operating system, and that may restore its functionality. Typically, you would go to the executable file itself, and you can right-click on it and choose Properties, and there is a Compatibility tab. This then allows you to choose from a drop-down list which version of the operating system you want to run it under, and hopefully that will resolve your problems. Again, this will depend on the make and model and various other considerations, but if you simply cannot seem to get a legacy device to work, it's certainly worth trying, but ultimately you may need to update that actual device itself to a newer model. In this video, we'll provide an overview of some of the error codes that can be generated when you are dealing with troubleshooting and resolving printing issues. Now, quickly, before getting into any specific errors, I do want to point out that error codes are usually not all that common anymore, at least not without some kind of a description as to what that error is all about. But going back to some earlier or legacy model devices, in some cases, they would just generate an error code with no indication as to what that error meant. So it really came down to verifying with the documentation because they weren't always consistent across every make and model. More modern devices may still generate an error code, but it would give you a description as well as to what the problem is. For example, it might actually tell you that the paper tray is empty. Therefore, you simply need to check the paper tray and make sure that there is paper there. If there isn't, then clearly simply load more paper. But rather than simply stating something like error code 11, which used to be a paper empty error code on some HP LaserJet models, it would actually tell you now very descriptively that there is no paper left. Now, one other quick note on the paper tray itself. It might not be a matter of the paper tray actually being empty. Rather, it simply wasn't pushed in all the way. So it thinks that there's no paper left, but it's just a matter of pushing the tray all the way in so that the paper can be accessed. Another common error in terms of generating a code is the printer open error, which literally means that the device itself was not properly closed. So if you were doing something like replacing the paper or possibly changing the toner or replacing the cartridges, in virtually every model, you have to open something to be able to do that, and you quite simply did not properly close whatever you opened. So it's just telling you that something needs to be closed. Now, this also might include the toner cartridge seating. So if, for example, you were replacing a toner cartridge and it was not fully inserted, then you might also receive the same printer open error message. And it's not out of the question that some models may actually generate that same error if there are problems with the cooling fan or the power connection. So again, this is going to come down to the documentation, but if you are just receiving some kind of a code that is not indicative of the specific problem, then you will have to go to the documentation. And if you don't have the actual hard copy, then you can almost certainly find the documentation on the manufacturer's website. But again, it might not seem all that obvious for a printer open error to be generated from something like the cooling fan or the power connection, but there are a lot of cases where any given make and model will generate the same error for several different problems. Paper jam errors, of course, will simply indicate that there is paper stuck in the printer. Now, typically this is a fairly easy fix, but it does require that you open the lid and remove the paper jam, which can in turn cause you to forget to close the lid, which may then generate the printer open error. But with respect to the paper jam itself, make sure that you are using the correct media size, the appropriate quality. For example, you might not be able to load something like photographic paper into the standard 8.5 by 11 tray. You might have a very specific paper tray for a specific type of quality paper. So just make sure that everything is consistent in that regard. Otherwise, you might end up attempting to feed the wrong type of paper through the wrong path, if you will, through the printer, and that could cause jams. Now, other common printer errors will typically include issues with the fusers if it's a laser printer. The laser unit itself can, of course, fail, as can the laser diode, the motor, and possibly the fan. Now, each of these may generate their own separate error codes. For example, error 50 on many LaserJet printers is indicative of a problem with the fuser, which is responsible for bonding the toner with the paper itself. If there is a malfunction with the laser unit itself, this may generate error 51, and errors 20 through 23 may all indicate a problem with the laser diode, which is the component that actually writes the information to the photosensitive drum. The motor may be indicated by error 54, and the fan may be indicated by error 60. But again, it's always going to come down to the specific make and model. Those are not necessarily consistent error codes across all makes and models. Other problems may include the rollers and the pads simply having reached the end of their life, so you'll just need to replace those components. An image rate error does actually refer to the printer speed settings, and in many cases it is an adjustable value, so you might need to simply change that value, or it is possible on some models that the printer will actually tell you that it has detected an incorrect image rate, and it will tell you what the acceptable value should be, and all you have to do is accept that value. And if it's a matter of a slow printing time, then this could be just due to the printing settings that you have requested. In other words, if you have set the resolution very high, then of course it's going to take longer to produce that print job. So that's not necessarily an error, but it could also be due to a memory issue on the printer in that there is not enough memory. Now, this will generate an error and it should tell you that it is out of memory. So in that case, you might actually be able to allocate more memory to that printer. And if you are attempting to produce a very high quality image, then you might end up with some kind of a resolution error in that you have requested something that is simply not supported by that particular device. Again, in these cases, the device will usually tell you that you are beyond the acceptable resolution range, and it might even give you an option to select the highest possible value, in which case you just select that and continue. But again, ultimately, it comes down to knowing what types of errors your printer is going to generate and knowing the characteristics of the device itself, such as the paper that it can support, both in terms of the size and the number of trays and which trays support which sizes. And as mentioned earlier, you just need to ensure that you understand the error codes that are being generated, and this will ultimately come down to reviewing the documentation. And as I said earlier, if you do not have the actual hard copy, then just go to the manufacturer's website to try to find out what that particular error code means. But hopefully you have a device that does actually tell you what the problem is, either through the interface of your computer itself or on the interface of the printer itself. But of course, knowing exactly what the problem is will certainly help you to troubleshoot more quickly, as opposed to having to run down an error code before you even know what the problem is itself. But as mentioned, many legacy devices do still just generate error codes. So you'll simply have to find out first what that code means, then determine how to best address that issue. In this presentation, we'll take a look at printer firmware and firmware updates. Now, before getting into the specifics of firmware, I would just like to take a moment to distinguish drivers from firmware. Both of them are fairly low-level software. In other words, they aren't like user-based applications, but there is a fundamental difference between the two. A driver is something that is always installed on the host computer to allow it to communicate with the device. So drivers act as the means for the computer to communicate with the printer. Firmware, on the other hand, is written directly into the device itself. It does not require any kind of host computer. So it's not unlike the BIOS in your computer. It is effectively part of the device itself. Now, that said, they do have something in common in that both of them will typically require updates or upgrades. Now, specifically with respect to firmware upgrades, these typically enable the device itself to improve its performance, or perhaps they are meant to address bugs that need to be corrected. And in many cases, they can actually add new features to the device, or perhaps they can improve its compatibility with other operating systems or applications, and possibly address some printer support issues. Now, I'll give you a very specific example of that point in just a moment. But one thing I'd like to come back to is the fact that when you do apply a firmware upgrade, again, it is something that is done directly in the device itself. In other words, you do not upgrade the firmware for your printer in your computer. Now, you may receive a message on your computer from the printer telling you that a firmware upgrade is available, and you may even be able to control that process through an interface on your computer, but you are still installing that upgrade into the printer itself. And in most cases, you don't even need your computer. If, for example, you have a menu system and a screen on the device itself, it will likely tell you within that interface that there is an update available, and you can simply apply it from there. Now, it would require that the printer itself have an active connection to the internet to download the upgrade, but in many cases, the upgrade has already been downloaded and it's just waiting to be installed. Now, that said, if the device is locally installed to your computer using something like a USB connection, then in fact the upgrade will download to your computer first, but it is then still ultimately transferred to the device. So it will depend on what kind of connection the device itself has, but if it's a network printer or a wireless printer, then it has a direct connection to the network and can therefore access the internet directly. And as mentioned in that case, it would not need your computer. So it will depend on how the printer is installed and controlled and managed, but one way or another, the firmware is installed directly into the device. Now, coming back to that printer support issue that I mentioned, one specific example of that is cartridge compatibility. Now, this comes down to the fact that sometimes there are non-OEM cartridges available so that users do not necessarily have to always buy the specific cartridges from the vendor of that printer. They are usually cheaper, but they might not be as high in quality. But if you are using a non-OEM cartridge and then you apply a firmware update or an upgrade, then all of a sudden those non-OEM cartridges may no longer be supported. The printer needs to directly communicate with the cartridges. There are electronics within the cartridges themselves. So the update may simply say that these non-OEM cartridges are no longer supported. Now, if that happens, I will tell you that in most cases, there is not an option to undo a firmware upgrade. I won't go so far as to say it's not an option at all, but usually upgrading the firmware on a printer is a permanent action. Now, that said, it is possible that you may be able to reset the device right back to its initial factory default state, in which case firmware updates may be removed, but again, that is going to depend on the device itself. So if that update has already applied and you can no longer use those non-OEM cartridges, then there's really not a lot that you can do. But if you discover that it happens on, let's say, one device and you have several others that are in the same office, you can at least prevent those other devices from receiving the update by disabling the automatic firmware updates. This will simply prevent that device from going out and checking for updates and even applying them if they happen to be available on something like your computer. Now, that would again be a feature that you would access within the interface of the printer itself. There might be an option to do it through your computer, but just like the firmware update is installed directly into the printer, disabling the automatic updates is a feature of the printer itself, not anything to do with your operating system or the software or the driver for that printer. Now, again, I do want to stress that this is a very specific situation. You may not encounter this at all. Maybe your printer doesn't even support non-OEM cartridges in the first place. So it's just an example, but I did want to point that out. In most cases, you do want your devices to receive firmware upgrades because, again, they do correct problems and enhance functionality and improve performance and increase compatibility. So it's generally a good idea to apply them and to generally ensure that the updates are coming down automatically so that you aren't missing a lot of updates, particularly for devices that may be starting to approach the end of their life cycle and may ultimately start to lose compatibility with certain devices or applications. The firmware upgrades may extend their lifespan by introducing new capabilities and new compatibility features. So once again, typically you do want your devices to receive automatic firmware updates. In this video, we'll examine some issues that may arise with respect to your screen display versus what you see when you actually print a document in color. Now, before we get into any specific issue, I do want to point out that this might not actually be an issue. In other words, the printer that you have simply might not be able to match exactly what you are seeing on the screen, and that's not particularly uncommon. But if there is an issue between the two, or a significant disagreement, it effectively comes down to the fact that monitors use RGB, or red, green, blue, to render images, whereas printers, or more specifically color printers, use CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and key. Now, the reason why it's actually K for key is because the key does refer to black, but black is in fact what's known as the key color palette because it's the one that is used to actually provide the detail within any given color. Plus, if the letter B were placed at the end, it could be confused with blue or brown. So again, the K, for all intents and purposes, does refer to black, but officially it's referred to as the key of the color palette. So again, when it comes to any issues that you may be encountering with respect to the differences that you're seeing on your display versus what you see on a color printed page, they are due to the fact that these are different color palettes, and you simply might not be able to get exactly the same results. Now, ideally, we do want them to be as close as possible, but since they are different color palettes, it's almost impossible to get them to be exact. Most notably, if you'll notice in the center overlap section for each color palette with RGB, when all three colors overlap, it actually produces white. Whereas in CMYK, where all three overlap, it actually produces the key color or the black. Monitors do not actually produce black. Rather, they just don't illuminate the pixels where black is required. So that's perhaps one of the biggest differences there, because of course if a printer simply did not print anything onto a white piece of paper, of course that area is just going to show as white. Whereas on a monitor, if the pixel is not illuminated, again, it displays as black. So with respect then to trying to match them as best as possible, there are values that you can adjust on possibly both the monitor and the printer. And some of those values might be listed as range, saturation, and contrast. Now, range quite literally is the amount of the color spectrum that can be covered from one point to another. Saturation is how intense the color is, and contrast is the difference of the variance between light and dark. So again, it's really going to come down to what you have for a display and or for a printer, and how closely you may be able to get them to match by adjusting these values. Now, with respect to making any kind of adjustment, of course, it is going to depend on what it is you are trying to match. Again, in many cases, when you are dealing with colors on a display versus colors on a printed page, it can simply be very difficult to match because some of them just don't produce the same colors. Again, officially, monitors do not really produce black, whereas printers do not really produce white. So that's one of the primary difficulties there. But of course, it really comes down to how accurate you need to be, specifically if you're dealing with text versus graphics. A document, for example, that is just text really is not going to be that much of an issue if the colors don't match perfectly, even if you are talking about colored text. But of course, if you're trying to print something like a photograph, and it looks entirely different on the screen than the resulting printed page, then clearly you might want to try to adjust those values again on either the printer or the monitor or both. Now, calibration is typically something that is done as maintenance on the printer, but it can help to produce sharper images or colors that are maybe a little more true because the print heads might need alignment or possibly cleaning. So again, it will always come down to what your needs are. But when trying to match the screen display to the color output of a printed page, there are always going to be certain challenges, and in some cases it's just going to be a matter of getting it as close as you possibly can with what you have. You'll likely never get a perfect match between the two. In this video, we'll address calibrating and cleaning printers and performing general maintenance, but I do want to actually begin with monitor calibration because, of course, it's difficult to know whether or not a printer might require any kind of maintenance if you aren't comparing that to what you are actually seeing on screen. So again, the general problem is that you see an image on your screen and you want to print it. Of course, you go ahead and do so, but then the printed result really just doesn't match what you are seeing on the screen. Now, clearly, there are going to be situations where this won't really matter all that much. For example, just a text-based document. But if you're talking about needing to print very detailed graphics or, of course, photographs, then this certainly can be an issue. So things might look perfect to you on the screen, but then when you print it, it just doesn't look the same at all and quite literally might not be acceptable. Now, that said, of course, it's not necessarily the printer that is the problem. It could be the monitor. Now, when you purchase a monitor, it is typically calibrated at the factory. So, in other words, it comes in a factory default state. But typically, there are settings that can be adjusted. So, if it seems to you as if the colors do not render properly on the monitor itself, then, of course, this is the place to begin. So, this would be the reverse scenario. Your printed page looks fine, but what you are seeing on the screen does not. So again, you certainly can calibrate the monitor, but it is going to be dependent on what you are seeing and how that looks to you. Now, clearly that can be a matter of perception as well, so you might want to bring in more than one set of eyes. But certain characteristics such as a glossy versus a matte display can alter your perception. Of course, again, be mindful of what the actual monitor settings are with respect to what they were in its factory default state versus what they are now. Maybe someone changed them and you aren't aware of that. So you may need to perform some very manual calibrations to try to adjust what the image looks like, or possibly reset it back to its factory default state if things seemed to appear fine when you first got it, but they no longer appear to be correct at this point in time. Now, if you really need to be specific, there are actually devices that can perform the calibration for you. There are sensors, if you will, that can actually capture the amount of each color being emitted from the screen, and then you can use that information to make very fine adjustments, but those would be in the most specific cases. But ultimately, again, this is all about just ensuring that everything on the display looks as accurate as possible before you print it. Then, from that point, of course, you are going to print the document, and if then the output does not seem to match what you are seeing on the screen, then of course you may need to perform a calibration of the printer itself. Now, there are, of course, mechanical calibrations that you can perform, usually just by invoking some kind of a maintenance routine on the printer itself, and I'll get into some specific examples in just a moment. But of course, you can also just perform some visual calibrations, although this will require some trial and error. In other words, you would have to print the image, try to determine what seems to be off, and then adjust a very specific setting. So that can be very time consuming. But the mechanical calibration usually involves just selecting some kind of a maintenance routine from a menu, and the printer will actually perform that task itself automatically. But the difficulty overall with respect to performing these calibrations really just comes down to the amount of variance. There are a tremendous number of different makes and models of monitors and a tremendous number of makes and models of printers. So you can effectively have any monitor with any printer, and the settings that they each offer are going to vary from model to model. So trying to get them to match can be a very complicated and time-consuming process. And ultimately, you may not be able to get an exact match. In fact, I'd say it's very unlikely that you would be able to get an exact match because monitors and printers simply use different color palettes to produce their images. Monitors use RGB, or red, green, blue, whereas color printers use cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So in some cases, they simply cannot entirely reproduce the exact same colors. But if you do suspect that the issue is with the printer, then one of the best tools to at least make sure that the printer is producing as high a quality image as possible is really to just perform regular maintenance, including cleaning the print heads and performing a print head alignment. Now, this is something that can be done on just about every model of inkjet printer, and there are similar routines with laser printers, but ultimately it's just performing that regular maintenance so that the print nozzles don't get clogged and that the alignment is as accurate as possible And of course, always ensure that you have adequate ink supplies and or toner supplies for the printers so that if you start to run low in the middle of a print job, you can replace those cartridges and reprint the job to get the best results possible. But ultimately, if it does appear to be the case that your print jobs never really seem to match the quality of your monitor, then you might want to consider upgrading to a higher level printer, or again, just making sure that it is cleaned and well maintained so that it can at least produce print jobs that have as high a level of quality as possible. In this video, we'll take a look at printing a test page from your printer, which, despite how simple that might sound, it can be a very useful tool for diagnosing issues with respect to the communication between your computer and the printer itself. Now, typically, this is something that is done after the initial installation. In fact, in almost every case that I can recall, whenever a printer installation wizard completes, the final step is almost always to print a test page. Now, this should also be something that you do after you install the included software for the printer. Now, I say that because many printers do give you the option to print a test page directly from the device itself, meaning that in fact you don't need to actually install the software or even connect it to your computer to print a test page in some cases. Those types of test pages, however, that can be produced directly from the printer itself really just tell you that the printer itself is functioning. In other words, it's nothing to do with the installation of that printer on your operating system. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but it would not verify things like connectivity to the computer or that you have installed the correct driver. It certainly would indicate that you've installed the ink cartridges correctly and that the device itself is capable of producing a printed page. So again, typically what you'll want to do is install all of the appropriate software for the printer onto your computer, then print your test page. Now, with that, you'll get some fairly standard information from the test page, including the driver version and the date, the printer model, and possibly some of the configuration settings, and maybe even some examples of the printing styles and or fonts that it can produce. And all of those will vary to a degree depending on the printer itself, of course, and the operating system that you're running on your computer. But in most cases, it will give you this basic information so that you can confirm that it is identifying your operating system as the correct version and that the driver date is the most up-to-date version possible. And on that note, the driver itself might not actually be the most recent if you are installing the software that came with the printer itself, because of course it could have been sitting on a shelf for months, during which time the driver has actually been updated. Now, it shouldn't cause any problems in terms of installation, but it's not a bad idea to go to the vendor's website to see if there is a newer version of that driver. Now, that said, once it is installed, it might go out and check for an update automatically itself, or it might be an option during the installation wizard. But one way or another, the test page will at least verify which version you are using. Now, in terms of printing the test page, as mentioned, you probably can still produce one from the printer control panel itself. And there's a couple of different considerations here. I already mentioned one, in that if you just produce the test page from the device before you even install it onto your computer, then it's not going to verify anything like the driver or the operating system because you haven't installed it yet, but it can still verify certain functionality. So again, it's never a bad idea to do this, but it won't include any of that information if you have yet to install it. Now, if you did install it, you probably could still produce the same test page, and it might in fact now include the operating system and driver information because it has been installed. So you might get that information post-install, but you certainly wouldn't pre-install. Now, there is another option that I want to inform you about in terms of printing pages directly from the printer itself. There are calibration pages that you can print that are used when you have a multifunction device such as a combination printer and scanner. This can help to align the print heads and perform various other maintenance tasks because you take the page that was just printed and you scan it. and the device is actually able to, if you will, see what the results of the printed page are through the scanner, and it can make adjustments accordingly in terms of some calibration tasks. But that in itself is not really the same as a test page, because what you are trying to test is ultimately connectivity to your computer. So you might consider that to be more of a maintenance page, if you will. But if you do print the test page from your operating system and it comes out successfully with that information, such as the driver and the date and some other details, then you know that the installation did succeed, and your operating system is seeing the printer and the printer is seeing your operating system. So again, it's basically just something that you would want to do to ensure that the printer is functioning, but that it also has connectivity with your computer. So again, as long as you can print a test page, then there's no reason why you should not be able to print from every other application on that computer. It ensures that you are connected. It ensures that bidirectional communication has been established as well. So for example, if the printer runs out of ink, it can send a message back to your computer to inform you that it's running low on ink, so you can change the cartridges. But ultimately, you always get that information when you print from the operating system, whereas if you print directly from the device itself, it ensures device functionality, but not necessarily functionality with the computer. In this video, we'll take a look at dealing with issues with the print queue. And for anyone who has ever stood in line, you effectively know what a print queue is all about. It is quite simply a holding area, or a waiting room, if you will, for all of the jobs that need to be processed. And if there are any problems with the print queue itself, then quite simply, the jobs won't print. Now, there can be a number of different reasons why this might occur. For example, you can, in just about every case, pause the print queue intentionally if perhaps you need to perform maintenance, such as just replacing the toner or the ink cartridges or even just paper, but possibly someone forgot to resume the queue after pausing it. As long as it is in a paused state, then no print jobs will be produced. Or it could be the case that the print queue is perfectly fine, but there are just many jobs waiting ahead of you. If you are in a very large, very busy printing environment, there could be dozens and dozens of jobs ahead of you, so yours is in the queue, but it's simply just waiting to be processed. Now, with respect to troubleshooting any issues with the queue, you can almost always use the graphic interface of the printer itself. In other words, once you install the printer using the appropriate software and driver, then you should be able to go to its interface, probably in something like Control Panel if you're running Windows, or System Preferences if you're running Mac. But this allows you to quite literally see which documents are waiting to be processed. In other words, you can view the queue. Now, if it is indicating that there is a problem somewhere in this interface, then one of the quick fixes that you can try if you are running a Windows system is to restart the spooler service. Now, every system running Windows has many services that run that support various activities of that computer. And specifically, the spooler service is what handles the submission of print jobs to the printer and manages the queue. So issues with the queue can typically be resolved by simply restarting this service. You just have to locate it in the list, right-click, and choose Restart. Now, this may require that the existing print jobs be resubmitted by the users, but they might not have to. They might just start processing again on their own. Or if that doesn't work, then you can try just deleting all of the jobs from the print queue and then have your users resubmit. If you delete them, the users will have to resubmit because the queue is at that point entirely empty. Now, it might not be a problem with the spooler service, so another option is to just try cycling the power of the printer itself. And I should also mention that with respect to the spooler service, if you were to reboot the computer that hosts that printer, then this, of course, would restart all services. So if it's not too intrusive to other processes to reboot the server, that is something that you can try, but it would be more likely in that case that users would have to resubmit their documents, but that should get everything going again. Now, another issue that you might have, as mentioned earlier, is simply too many documents in the queue. in which case you might want to check the memory of the printer itself. Many higher level printers do actually have RAM in them, and if you run out of memory, then it quite simply might stop processing jobs. Now, similar to what we just mentioned, you might just be able to cancel some of the print jobs and have users resubmit, but that could be a little bit tedious and you might not be exactly certain which ones will continue to print versus which ones will have to be resubmitted. So if you do add more memory, for example, then the queue will be able to support more jobs at any one given time. But for the specific problem at hand, it might be easier to just cancel all of the jobs as opposed to trying to just selectively determine which jobs might free up the most space in memory. Something else you can always do is to check the device logs. If, for example, you have been experiencing problems on a regular basis, then it's certainly a good idea to go to the logs to see how frequently the queue might have failed or at least stalled. And similarly, you can also go to the operating system logs for the computer or the server that hosts that device. Again, if there are issues with the service, then that would most certainly show up in the log. If it's an issue with the device itself, that might not show up in your operating system logs, but it certainly should show up in the device log. So that will be dependent on which particular type of printer you have in terms of accessing those device logs, but many modern devices do provide them. Finally, you can also, of course, check for any error codes, but once again, error codes are usually specific to the make and/or the model. So you would certainly need to refer to the documentation to determine which error codes mean which possible states, and in many cases the codes themselves may not reveal the issue. If, for example, the printer has stopped producing print jobs, it might generate some kind of an error code, but if the problem itself is with the print spooler service on the print server, then this might not be indicated in the error code, or it might not be at least fully indicated. You might see some kind of a communication error, for example, with the server, but that would not specifically tell you that the print spooler service on the server has failed. So again, there can be more to the problem than just what you are seeing in error codes, but it never hurts to get more information. Ultimately, print queue errors aren't particularly common, and they're relatively easy to deal with if you do encounter them, but I would certainly suggest that you try some of those more obvious fixes first, such as just cycling the power of the printer and/or restarting the print spooler service before digging into log files or trying to decipher error codes. In this video, we'll take a look at troubleshooting issues that may result from incorrect page orientation. Now, there are only two options with respect to the orientation, portrait and landscape. And quite simply, portrait, if we consider an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, is 8.5 on the top and the bottom and 11 along the sides. Landscape rotates that 90 degrees so that 11 is on the top and the bottom and 8.5 are the sides. Now, if you print something in the incorrect orientation, of course, that's a relatively easy fix. You just change it and reprint. Worst case scenario, you may have wasted a piece of paper. But there can be situations whereby you are specifying one orientation and you're not getting it, or you've chosen the correct orientation, but the resulting printed page is produced as if it was set to the incorrect orientation. In other words, you chose portrait and that's what you wanted, but the document was actually produced as if you chose landscape. So the text or the sentences might be running right off the edge of the page, and you end up getting something like a second page where that additional runoff text was placed, even though the document might only be one page in length. So then, with respect to why some of those issues might occur or how you deal with them, in many cases, it comes down to the fact that the orientation can be set in either the print driver interface or the software application that you're using when you choose the print dialog box and you see a page setup. Now, if, for example, you are working in a word processor and you want to print that document, then invariably you will use the interface from within that software, and you can just choose the appropriate orientation, and most of the time that should be fine. But it is possible that the orientation could be set within the driver interface, and that may be ignoring the request from the application. Now, that's not particularly common, but it is a possibility. So you may just have to verify that both interfaces are set to the correct orientation. Now, you might encounter other problems in terms of orientation due to what's referred to as large page elements. In other words, if you think of something like a web page, and if you try to print that, there could be an element of that page that is simply too large to fit in some